In the spring of 1918, soldiers went to sleep healthy and woke up dying. A fever would strike without warning. Muscles would ache as if bones were breaking from within. Within days, sometimes hours, entire barracks fell silent, not from enemy fire, but from something invisible. Across military camps, hospitals overflowed, coffins ran out, and a single terrifying question echoed everywhere. Was this the end of the world? What they didn't realize was that they were witnessing the deadliest pandemic in recorded human history. One that would kill more people than the Great War itself and reshape the 20th century forever. This was the Spanish flu, and once it began, there was no escape. To understand the devastation that followed, we must first understand the world that existed before. By 1918, the Great War had raged for nearly 4 years. Europe was a charnel house. Millions had already died in the trenches, ground down by industrial warfare on an unprecedented scale. But a new force was about to enter the conflict: the United States of America. Millions of young American men were mobilized, trained in massive camps, then packed onto ships bound for Europe. They were farmers, factory workers, students, young, healthy, in the prime of their lives. The largest of these training camps was Camp Funston, Kansas, home to over 50,000 men living in close quarters. They ate together, slept together, breathed the same air, the perfect conditions for what was about to happen. They had no idea that an invisible enemy had already infiltrated their ranks. The world in early 1918 was more connected than ever before. Steamships crossed oceans in days. Trains linked continents. This interconnectedness had brought prosperity and progress, but it was about to become a highway for death. The same ships and trains that moved armies and commerce would soon carry the deadliest cargo in human history. The morning of March 4th, 1918, began like any other at Camp Funston. Just after breakfast, an army cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with a bad cold, sore throat, fever, headache. His temperature was 103 degrees. The doctors noted his symptoms and sent him to bed. By noon, over 100 soldiers had reported the same symptoms. By week's end, over 500. The camp doctors had never seen anything like it. The speed of transmission was unprecedented. Urgent reports were sent up the chain of command, but the war effort could not be stopped. Military commanders faced an impossible choice. The troops were needed in France. The ships were already scheduled. They decided to proceed. The war came first. It was a decision that would cost millions of lives. Some patients developed a terrifying symptom. Their skin turned blue, then purple, then black. They drowned in their own fluids. The disease seemed to strike the young and healthy hardest. The strongest soldiers fell fastest, and then the infected soldiers began shipping out to other camps, to the ports, to Europe. The virus hitched a ride on the greatest military mobilization in American history. Its journey around the world had begun. In the spring of 1918, nearly 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic to join the fight. Below decks, men were packed like sardines, thousands sharing the same stale air. The ships became floating incubators. Ship doctors watched helplessly as the illness spread from bunk to bunk. There was nowhere to isolate the sick. Every morning brought new deaths. Bodies were wrapped in canvas and committed to the deep. The war hadn't even reached them yet. When the ships reached France, the virus disembarked with the troops. It had successfully crossed the Atlantic. The Americans were greeted as liberators. The French had no idea what else had arrived with them. Behind the front lines, soldiers from America, Britain, France, and a dozen other nations lived side by side. They shared trenches, shared food, shared water. National boundaries meant nothing to the virus spreading among them. Field hospitals built to treat war wounds were suddenly overwhelmed by a different kind of casualty. And then something remarkable happened. The flu crossed no man's land. It began killing the enemy too. German commanders reported entire divisions incapacitated. Their spring offensive, meant to win the war, ground to a halt. For the first time in history, a disease was directly influencing the outcome of a global conflict. Meanwhile, the virus continued its relentless global march. It followed the trade routes and shipping lanes. It reached London, Paris, Berlin. Then it boarded ships heading south and east. In the crowded cities of the industrial age, the virus found endless new hosts. It arrived in India aboard a troop ship in late May. Within weeks, it had spread across the entire subcontinent. India, with its dense population and limited healthcare, would suffer more than any other nation, perhaps 18 million dead. The railways that the British had built to connect their empire now carried death to every corner of India. So many died that the Ganges became choked with bodies. There wasn't enough wood to burn them all. The virus reached even the most isolated communities on Earth. Remote Alaskan villages lost 90% of their population. In Africa, where colonial medicine was weakest, entire villages were found with no survivors. It reached the islands of the Pacific, carried by the same ships that brought supplies and mail. South America, Australia, Japan. No inhabited place on Earth was spared. In an age before air travel, the Spanish flu circumnavigated the globe in just 4 months. It was everywhere. The first wave of the flu in spring 1918 had been severe, but what came next was catastrophic. In September 1918, the USS Leviathan departed New York, carrying over 9,000 soldiers. It was a floating city. By the second day at sea, the flu was raging through the ship. Men collapsed in the corridors. The sick bays overflowed onto the decks. The Leviathan buried nearly 100 men at sea. It arrived in France as a ghost ship, with 2,000 soldiers too sick to walk off. Back home, despite warnings from doctors, Philadelphia held a massive parade to support the war effort. 200,000 people gathered. They cheered, they sang, they embraced, they shared the air. It was the largest gathering in Philadelphia's history. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was full. Within a week, over 4,000 were dead. Emergency hospitals were set up in armories, schools, and churches. They filled as fast as they opened. The morgues ran out of space. Bodies were stacked in hallways, in storage rooms, in the streets. There weren't enough coffins. There weren't enough gravediggers. There weren't enough priests to perform last rites. The city resorted to mass graves. Steam shovels dug trenches. Bodies were buried in layers. Cities across America shut down. Schools closed. Churches closed. Public gatherings were banned. Citizens were ordered to wear masks. Those who refused faced fines and arrest. Some protested. Anti-mask leagues formed. They called the mandates unconstitutional, an overreach of government power. Public health officials pleaded with citizens. Cover your cough. Don't spit. Stay home if sick. The same advice we know today. At night, cities that had bustled with life fell into eerie silence. America was holding its breath. The cruelest aspect of the Spanish flu was who it killed. Not the old and weak, but the young and strong. Pregnant women died at terrifying rates. Infants were left beside dead mothers. The pandemic created a generation of orphans. Young adults between 20 and 40 died at the highest rates. The flu triggered a cytokine storm, turning strong immune systems against their hosts. Doctors and nurses fell sick by the thousands. There was no one left to care for the dying. Medical schools graduated students early. Nursing programs accelerated. Retired doctors were called back to service. The nurses who served became the true heroes of 1918. Many gave their lives caring for strangers. Families huddled around radios listening for news. Every knock on the door brought fear. Every cough was a death sentence. Funerals were limited to immediate family. Many died alone, buried without ceremony, mourned from a distance. Families who had sent sons to war received telegrams, not killed in action, but died of influenza. But even in the darkest times, humanity showed its resilience. Neighbors helped neighbors. Volunteers risked their lives. Native American communities were devastated. Some tribes lost a quarter of their population. Ancient knowledge died with the elders. Grandmothers sewed masks. Children rolled bandages. Everyone fought in their own way. Priests gave last rites through closed doors. Final words were shouted, not whispered. Even death had changed. Churches moved services outdoors. Congregations spread across parks and fields. Faith found a way. Soldiers at the front received letters bearing impossible news. Their families were gone. There was nothing to come home to. Schools sat empty for months. Children forgot what normal felt like. A generation grew up marked by fear. As autumn turned to winter, the Great War reached its final act. Both sides were exhausted, depleted by combat and disease alike. The German army, ravaged by flu and starvation, began to collapse. Soldiers surrendered by the thousands. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The Great War was over, but the flu was not. The news of peace triggered celebrations unlike anything seen before. Millions poured into the streets, embracing, kissing, crying with joy. In their relief and exhaustion, people forgot the warnings. They gathered, they celebrated, they spread the virus. The armistice celebrations became super-spreader events. The third wave of flu followed within weeks. The soldiers began coming home. They returned as heroes, carrying victory and disease in equal measure. Families who had prayed for their sons' safe return embraced them. Some would be burying them within weeks. Even President Wilson fell ill with the flu during the peace negotiations in Paris. Some historians believe it affected his judgment at Versailles. The treaty they created would plant the seeds of another world war. Decisions made by exhausted, sick men shaped the 20th century. By spring of 1919, the virus had finally run its course. The pandemic was ending, not through medicine, but through nature. The virus had simply run out of new victims. Those who survived had immunity. The rest were dead. When the final toll was counted, the numbers were almost impossible to comprehend. At least 50 million dead worldwide, perhaps as many as 100 million, more than the Great War, more than any plague in history. Scientists desperately tried to identify what had killed so many. They searched for a bacterium. The virus was too small to see. Governments created new public health agencies. The pandemic had revealed how unprepared civilization was for biological disaster. In the United States alone, 675,000 died. More Americans than in all the wars of the 20th century combined. The survivors carried invisible scars. Children grew up without parents. Parents outlived their children. The grief was bottomless. And then something strange happened. The world chose to forget. The Spanish flu vanished from public memory. There were no monuments, no memorials, no annual remembrances, just silence. Survivors rarely spoke of what they had witnessed. The trauma was too great. They buried it with the dead. It took nearly 80 years before scientists finally identified the killer. Frozen tissue from victims preserved in permafrost held the answer. The Spanish flu was an H1N1 influenza virus. It had jumped from birds to humans, then mutated into something extraordinarily lethal. Today, the Spanish flu is studied intensively, not as history but as a warning. The world that emerged from 1918 is our world, more connected than ever, more vulnerable than ever. We live in cities of millions. We travel by air across continents in hours. A virus can circle the globe in days. When the next pandemic came, the images were hauntingly familiar. Masks, quarantines, overwhelmed hospitals, mass graves. The lessons of 1918 had been forgotten, and so they had to be learned again. But we have tools today that 1918 could never imagine. Vaccines developed in months, not decades. The power to fight back. This time, we must not forget. We must remember the dead. We must learn from their sacrifice. The Spanish flu was not ancient history. It was a dress rehearsal. And history has a way of repeating. 50 million voices silenced. A world transformed by invisible death. The Spanish flu reminds us that civilization is fragile and that we forget at our peril.